I'm gonna be honest. Most Alienware desktop gaming PCs completely suck. I think most of us know that by now.
We have made too many irreversible mistakes in our development.
Back in the day, Alienware used to have at least some respect with their big and bubbly high-end gaming PC pre-builts, but this was before the times of PC gaming becoming more mainstream, way before PC building and flipping became popular, and definitely before much better pre-built websites like Jawa came around. But that doesn't mean that you can't find good value with them on the used market, especially if you know what you're looking for. That's exactly what I did with this build. That's exactly what I'm gonna teach you to do, all after a quick word from today's sponsor. Since I know my audience is always interested in saving money when building and selling gaming PCs, today's video sponsor, GVG Mall, can definitely help you out with that. I've worked with GVG Mall for so long now and have bought probably close to 100 keys myself, and they're hooking you all up big time with the 25% off discount if you use code ZTT18 with the link in the description. GVG Mall has Windows activation keys as well as Microsoft Office, game keys for platforms like Steam and Origin, and they even have console stuff too like PSN and Xbox prepaid cards. Activating Windows couldn't be easier. Just paste in the key that you get instantly after paying on the website, so remove that ugly unactivated watermark for good. Don't forget to use ZTT18 for 25% off with the link in the description. All right, so before you start scouring the internet for Alienware pre-built gaming PCs, let's lay some ground rules first. First, just like the very first sentence I said in this video, please understand that most Alienware suck. The value that you're getting just isn't anywhere close to where it should be because most of the time they aren't using meta CPU and GPU combinations, and they also use proprietary cases and motherboards, which makes your upgrade path and case swapping a nightmare. But if you understand what a good pre-built should have in terms of the CPU and GPU combination, you can eventually find those specs in an Alienware that's not super overpriced. The other potential upside of shopping for Alienwares is that most of the people who bought Alienwares back in the day, no offense to any of you, probably didn't know what they were doing and weren't up to speed on the PC market, so they sometimes end up selling them for lower than what they should. On the flip side, the opposite can happen because some people still think that Alienwares are all worth $10,000 and they think they're gonna get a ton of money for their decade-old PC. Our job as knowledgeable PC builders and gamers is to separate those good deals from the bad ones, and sometimes you can actually find some good ones. The one I scooped up and the one we're looking at today is the Aurora R11, and this thing is packing an Intel i5-10400 that's liquid cooled, 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM, a 1TB NVMe SSD, and we even have a GTX 1660 Ti in there. I recently sniped this off eBay for exactly $450, and that's a pretty good price for just the spec sheet alone. If you go on Jawa right now and search for pre-builts between $425 and $475, you're gonna find PCs with the GTX 1060, the RX 580, and possibly even older. These are pretty standard for that price range and not terrible by any means, but what I'm trying to highlight is that our build is much better than that. A GTX 1660 Ti completed system for $450 is actually pretty wild. We're gonna benchmark it in just a bit, but now let's talk about the drawbacks compared to a custom pre-built because this is an Alienware. First up, the PC was extremely dirty because the previous owner probably had no idea that they were supposed to clean it every now and then. But we took care of that, and now there's only a minimal layer of dust. Once you do figure out how to open up the PC, and it's not easy, trust me on that, here you can see that we're dealing with a super funky layout. Our power supply is right over top of the CPU along with some drive cages, and this whole opening contraption is just super weird and finicky. When you open the door, the power supply cable connecting to the GPU extends with it, and if you're not careful, you can easily rip this connector right out of there, most likely damaging the GPU.
It's gotta go back.
How could they cut the power, man? They're animals.
This power supply is indeed an 80+ gold 550 watt unit though, which doesn't look too shabby, but if you do want to do any sort of GPU upgrade in here, you'll probably want to upgrade the power supply to go along with it. And speaking of which, thankfully our motherboard does allow you to do that. We have the standard 8-pin CPU connector and 24-pin motherboard connector. Sometimes these pre-builts will have proprietary connectors, which makes case swapping almost impossible. Unfortunately, our motherboard does get in the way of an easy case swap though, because the IO shield is built right into the case, so if you brought this motherboard to a different case, you wouldn't have any sort of IO shield. Not a huge deal, but something to be aware of. The other part that you probably wouldn't want to take with you is the AIO, and that's because this is a unique Alienware design with ultra short AIO tubes because it's just going up here to the top. This is just a 120mm unit, so nothing super impressive, but they had to do this because of the power supply sitting right over top of the CPU. Clearly, there's no room for an air tower here. And while we're talking about cooling, this Alienware is actually pretty good, but I would probably attribute that to the low-end hardware Alienware and not necessarily because it actually has a good cooling system. We did a 10-minute Cinebench stress test for both the CPU and GPU, and our i5-10400 only ever peaked at 65 degrees and the GPU only got up to 76 degrees. And as far as upgrading a PC like this goes, like I said, any sort of case swap isn't going to be ideal here, but certainly not impossible, but there are a few upgrades that would make more sense. Again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend you specifically target an Alienware build like this to upgrade, but if you happen to find one on a great deal or just stumble upon one, there are some reasonable upgrades you can make. For the CPU, we're limited by the LGA 1200 socket, but you could easily go up to an i7 without having any issues since that AIO is probably good enough. This motherboard can be a little picky when it comes to RAM, but I'd just recommend getting a duplicate HyperX kit to go up to a 4x8GB setup for 32GB. And for storage, there's only one NVMe port on here, so if you want more space, you'll either have to completely swap out the 1TB drive that's in here, or you could get an additional 2.5-inch SATA SSD because there's plenty of SATA ports and drive bays open. And before we get into the performance of the build, let's talk about the aesthetics real quickly, and honestly, this build doesn't look terrible. The front has some nice lighting if that's what you're into, and there's also a good amount of ports up here, including a USB-C as well. And the side panel obviously isn't tempered glass, but it shouldn't be because otherwise you'd be looking at that ugly power supply rack. But overall, if you have an all-black build like this with some lights up here at the front sitting on the ground underneath a desk, I don't think most people will really mind how this one looks. But what's obviously more important in a budget pre-built like this over the aesthetics is the performance, so let's see what the 10400 and GTX 1660 Ti can do here in 2024. It's been a long time since I tested a 1660 Ti, so I'm kind of curious about this myself. Let's see what Sam whipped up here. First up, we'll try Time Spy per usual, and this $450 Alienware build managed to get a score of 6,308. For reference, that's just a tad bit over my previous $500 mint color gaming PC build, but I mentioned in that video multiple times that it wasn't the most optimized parts list, just like this Alienware. I also put together a Ryzen 5 3600 and GTX 1080 PC for a flip just 2 months ago in Flippin' Friday Season 2 episode number 1, and that PC was only $400 but cranked out a Time Spy score of 7,388. The score for this Alienware isn't too bad, but certainly nowhere close to the most optimized you can get with a properly customized build. Next up, Sam fired up Cyberpunk 2077, and when using the built-in benchmarking tool, we actually got a bit above that 60 FPS target mark using not 1080p low, but 1080p medium settings. Consider me a little impressed. After that, we tested Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, and again, with 1080p balance settings, he got 74 FPS, which is pretty impressive. Assassin's Creed Mirage followed up after that, and with 1080p medium, we got 73 FPS. Here's the rest of the games that we tested, and per usual, other than Starfield, everything is running pretty well around 1080p high settings, so it's great to see that an Alienware like this can definitely still play every title here in 2024. Now, before you click off this video, I need to make sure you're aware of some of the scams I saw and just the overall landscape of the used Alienware market. Right now, there are an absolute ton of $500 to $700 Alienwares on places like eBay and Mercari, but in a lot of them, the GPU is either completely stripped out and they aren't super clear about that in the posting, or the GPU has been replaced with something worse like a GTX 1650. I spent a ton of time having to dissect these eBay postings, and you can tell that these people know what they're doing because they'll do things like mark that it has a dedicated GPU, but won't actually include the model. Or they'll post in the title that it has a GTX 1660 Ti like mine, but down in the details section, they'll say that the GPU was swapped out for a 1650 or something worse. I do think a first-time PC buyer has a chance at sniping one of these legit ones like I did on a good deal, but please don't attempt to do this unless you have confidence that you know what you're looking for. At a minimum, for any pre-built around this price range, I would recommend looking for these types of specs. Make sure that the CPU is either an Intel i5 or a Ryzen 5, preferably Intel 10th gen or higher or Ryzen 3000 or higher. Definitely get 16 gigs of DDR4 on there, preferably a 1TB SSD or possibly 500 gigabytes would be fine. And for the GPU, I would look for GTX 1600 series, like a 1660, 1660 Super, or a 1660 Ti, or sometimes they'll have an RTX 2060 or even a 2060 Super. You should also make sure that you're buying from a reputable seller, because if you go to Mercari right now and type in Alienware, you're gonna see a ton of them being posted by fake accounts that have a 0-star rating and no successfully sold items. Definitely don't buy from accounts like that. But yeah, hopefully this video proved that sometimes if you know what you're doing, all Alienwares don't have to suck. But if you do want to spend this kind of money on a custom build yourself that you build from scratch, then feel free to click the video that's on the screen now.